Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. It's my great pleasure to be chairing this strategic preview of next week's UN General Assembly, the first physical one since before the pandemic began, because of course it was virtual last year. Hugely important UNGA next week in New York. Now, none of us need reminding that this pandemic has taken everybody by surprise, when it really shouldn't have taken us by surprise. The world has been awash in the last 10, 20 years with warnings about the risks of zoonotic transfer of disease to the human population. And from the Gates Foundation to the United Nations, there's been so many warnings about looming pandemics. And yet we were caught underprepared. It's worth emphasizing that in the pre-pandemic preparedness rankings that a lot of organizations did, the United States came first in preparedness and Britain came second. So even the countries that were supposed to be best prepared were woefully unprepared in practice. As Mike Tyson famously said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And I dread to think what the preparedness reports for global warming might tell us. Now, one of the key sort of lessons, silver linings, if you like, of this pandemic, particularly in the context of climate change, is that it has taught us just what a common threat is, a cross-border common threat to humanity is, and the need for cross-border international cooperation. And I think that if you look at that as a sort of, not silver lining, because this has been and remains a ghastly pandemic, 4.5 million dead, probably double that in practice. But if it teaches us habits of cooperation for future pandemics and for climate change and other common threats, then at least that's something we can take away with this. But unfortunately, in practice, what it has done is crystallized the great rift between the US and China, which has, for most of this pandemic, effectively disabled the WHO. And so that is another sort of key element of what we're going to be discussing in these three panels today. It's also worth emphasizing, just yesterday, John Kerry, Biden's climate envoy, had to make an appeal for the British hosts of the upcoming UN Summit on Climate Change, COP26, this November, to go ahead and hold this summit, because there have been calls for it to be postponed because of COVID and quarantining, etc. So let's hope that those obstacles can be overcome and that summit can indeed be held. With that in mind, let's turn to the first panel, which looks at climate change, which is chaired by my wonderful colleague in London, Leslie Hook, who's our Environment and Clean Energy correspondent.
I'm delighted to welcome our three fantastic panelists. We have Rachel Kite, Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University, Jerome Powell, an advisor to the White House on climate issues and founder of 1 Million of Us, and Brad Smith, president of Microsoft. Thank you so much for being here. Our topic is, as Ed mentioned, the issue of climate change. And we're at kind of a pivotal moment here, about 7 weeks ahead of the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow, which starts at the beginning of November. Next week, climate change will be a big issue at the UN General Assembly. And on Monday, the Secretary General will be convening about 30 heads of state in person for a special session devoted to climate change. But they also have a very tough task ahead of them and kind of an uphill battle. A few weeks ago, we had a warning from the IPCC about the state of the planet and the impact that global warming is having, not in the future, but already today. So my first question to the three of you is, what would you like to see happen at the UN General Assembly, at COP26? What is the sort of best case scenario? What would be a good outcome in your view? And Rachel, I'll go to you first.
Well, hi, Leslie. Thank you. It's great to be here. When the Secretary General convenes just a small group of 30 leaders, what he's going to be doing is asking them to put a lot of effort in over the next 40-odd days to try to cement the strongest political package possible at COP26. And that really has three pillars to it. One is clarifying ambition for certain key polluting countries, sort of stopping the doing of stupid things, so ending subsidies and get some stronger commitments there, to really come up with the strongest and most robust package that they can on adaptation. Obviously, countries are already experiencing extreme impacts from climate change. That's focused imagination over the last few months. And what is that adaptation package looking like? Can more be done? And then thirdly, finance. Now, the UK presidency has said that COP26 is about coal, cars, cash, and trees. Well, both on coal and cash, things could be done. All eyes will be on China, whether China will use the General Assembly as an opportunity to clarify its exit from coal, and in particular, its financing of coal overseas. And then all eyes are on the United States to come with more finance. While John Kerry is working furiously to stitch together the leveraging of private finance and to do other things which are creative and innovative, the US is behind in its commitments and finance. And if it were to make a bigger and bolder commitment to make up for the years that it lost, that would go a long way in meeting the totemic 100 billion climate finance requirement that is a hangover from previous negotiations. So some of these things could clear the pathway for COP26 if leaders were prepared to act politically, and that's what the Secretary General will ask of them.
So more money and action on coal, and a real need for the political will to come together and get that signal from those leaders that are there. Jerome, I'd like to turn to you next. What would you like to see from the General Assembly next week? I know you spent over a year, I think 58 weeks protesting outside the White House for climate action. It's been a lot of change since you first started those protests, but what would you like to see happen next week?
Yes, so when we talk about what we want to see at the UNGA next week and what action really needs to happen, is that we need for America to step up and be the global leader that it says it wants to be. Also, we need for the dialogue to shift from a talk of carbon neutrality and a talk of, oh, well, we need to fiddle around the margins, whether it comes to coal, whether it comes to transportation of oil. Well, that goes to our double talk on reliance on fossil fuels while also trying to shift to clean energy. We need to have clear political fortitude that's seen at UNGA and at COP26. And what that really means is that from my climate strikes and from the young people that organized in 2019 and 2020, we need to have our demands met, whether that comes to the Climate Change Education Act, which will teach young Americans and young people around the world to be able to enter into sustainability jobs, or whether that comes to where we have to end subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. Right now, when we talk about the economics of climate, it really isn't a free market. It is completely rigged because governments have sided with and continue to side with the fossil fuel industry by giving handouts and subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. We need to have a level playing field where renewables can fairly compete with fossil fuels, because we know for a fact that solar panels and wind turbines are cheaper per kilowatt hour to fossil fuels. So we need to see that type of action seen at the UNGA next week.
So the US has sort of started to talk the talk, but you'd like to see them walk the walk and really put actions to match their words. And Brad, what about you? What would you like to see next week at the UN General Assembly?
Well, I would like to get started, I think, by building on what you've heard already. I think the one thing that we can fairly predict is both next week and at COP26, the great questions before the world will be, are we moving fast enough and what more do we need to do? And the answer is clear, we're not moving fast enough and there's a lot more that needs to get done. I would point to two additional areas that I think it's critical to add to the agenda. The first may not be the most dramatic or exciting, but I will argue it is the most fundamental to everything else. We need urgently to build the capacity for all of us around the world to measure carbon emissions in a consistent, effective, and efficient manner. We've all embraced the need to reduce emissions, but we should recognize that our ability to measure them is remarkably nascent and is inconsistent around the world. And it's like asking everybody on the planet to go on a diet, but suggesting that no one ever step on a scale to see how we're doing. That is the state of affairs today. And unless we address this effectively, we really risk, I think, deceiving ourselves in terms of how we're doing in the coming years. And then the second thing I would say is, in addition to all of the steps needed to reduce emissions, we need to build a new market for carbon removal as well. We need to help foster an industry that frankly doesn't yet exist today. We need to invest in the technologies that can help us remove carbon. And so there are these elements that I think need to be added to the agenda, the first being the most urgent, but the second being equally important from a long-term perspective.
So not just looking at the political commitments, but also the need to measure and verify emissions and look at carbon removal, which is pulling carbon dioxide from the air.
Correct.
Next, I'd like to ask the three of you about the role of the private sector. The UN General Assembly is really about governments and political will and leadership, but in the past 12 or 18 months, we've also seen the private sector really shift its tone in terms of what it's doing on climate change and climate commitments, including from companies like Microsoft. I'm looking at Brad there that have pledged to go carbon negative by 2030. Is the private sector doing enough? And what sort of signals will there be from the UN General Assembly that the private sector should perhaps take heed of? And Rachel, I'm going to come to you first for that.
Well, I think two points. So Brad makes some very, very important points about sort of the role that the private sector can play in sort of building the new architecture and the new way we govern ourselves in a world that has to rapidly decarbonize. And I think we are in that world. We're in a world now where we've got governments and the private sector and civil society working together around the new rules for high integrity in carbon markets, and what are going to be the ways to put satellites up in the air that measure methane and make that data available to everybody everywhere in real time. So we're in that world, but the General Assembly is sacrosanct, especially for developing countries. It's the one place where it's one country, one vote. And I think we can't, while we nurture forward this world, we have to understand that developing countries come to this General Assembly feeling extremely, to put it politely, frustrated and aggrieved. We have failed to bring forward a global vaccination program which protects everybody. We are facing a climate crisis which is having huge impacts on the GDP of these countries who did nothing to put themselves in this place. And we have no commensurate plan to help, and we have no deal on climate finance. And so they'll be forgiven for thinking that we talk a lot about our excitement, but we don't do the basics in terms of lifting everybody up. And that's the politics of the General Assembly, and that's the politics that the UN are having to manage. And as we come into COP26, every day that goes by, the closer we get to COP26, where really the pledge of solidarity from the developed world is not really on the table, it makes the kinds of political agreements that are necessary very difficult. So we're in a two-speed world. The private sector can see around the corner, can see what needs to be done. It needs to be nurtured. We need to make that transparent and available to everybody. And developing countries are saying, look, you've been making big promises around money and technology for a very long time, and we're not seeing it yet, and it's not flowing. So I think we're trying to straddle those two things.
That's right. And that's why we have seen last week, as Ed alluded to, a call from over 1,500 climate groups saying that COP26 should in fact be postponed because it was unfair to developing countries and the global south, which doesn't have access to vaccines at the same rate. And it's much more difficult for those delegations to get to Glasgow and even attend COP26. Jerome, I'm going to come to you next. I'd love to hear your response to some of those points that Rachel made about the need for equity and the sort of divisions that we're starting to see between developing countries and the developed world, which will be, of course, on display next week.
Yes, when it comes to what Rachel spoke to and the question overall of what role private sectors play, what we have to think about is the fact that what we need right now is the political fortitude, the financial intelligence, and the socio-political awareness of what needs to happen for us to progress to the next level. The problems that define our time right now have been solved with technology, and they have already been solved. They've already been thought through, and they've already been implemented. But right now, what we need is for them to be implemented through government and for them to be followed up by organizations and by companies in collaboration with community organizers that can develop the mechanical systems, the technology, the software, and the vehicles of implementation that can advance us to that next era of renewable energy and away from the era of dirty and polluting fossil fuels. With regards to what's happening right now with COP26 being postponed and what developing nations need in the aspect of equity, what we're seeing right now is a complete lack of equity because we're only talking about what rich nations haven't done and not talking about the fact that richer countries have continued and continue to pollute and destroy communities at the front lines, whether that's South America, whether that's the African continent, or whether that's Southeast Asia. They are reeling from the effects of rich countries that are literally polluting massively in exorbitant numbers that are feeling the least impacts right now. But the people that have polluted the least are being impacted first and worse. Communities right now like Guatemala, like communities like Bangladesh and communities like Uganda are reeling from a crisis that they didn't cause, but they're not even being invited to the table to talk about solutions. The communities at the global south right now have an immense wealth of knowledge about how we must live in tandem and with collaboration with nature. But right now, our economic systems and our political models live at odds with the natural cycles. So that at its core is it completely not working in tandem with what we say we want to do. If we want to transition away from fossil fuels and transition to renewable energy, we have to work with the leaders that have been around for thousands of years that have that knowledge and have that experience of working with nature and working alongside nature. What also has to happen is that for companies, they have to continue to know that this isn't just something that you can say, oh, we're gonna eventually get there. But what we have to see, and companies like Microsoft have been doing this, is that they've actually made commitments and actually year over year have to show progress that they've made. That is what the role of corporations have. It's to not just say overall great talking points and great rhetoric, but actually follow that up with real and tangible action and solutions that impact communities right now. In America, we have millions and millions of people that are looking for good paying and dignified jobs. And right now, we need for companies to follow that up with the infrastructure for people to be employed in creating solar farms and wind turbines, because that's the future of America and the rest of the world.
So you see a clear role for the private sector, but it won't really add up to much if some of the fundamental issues of equality and justice can't be addressed first.
Absolutely.
Brad, how do you see this issue?
Well, I think this is a great conversation because your question is the private sector doing enough? And I think the answer you've heard quite rightly, is that we're not yet at a stage where anyone is doing enough. If anyone was doing enough, we would probably be making more progress than every scientific report says we are. So if I sort of think about the role of the private sector, the first thing I would say was 2020 was sort of the year of expanding climate pledges by a number of large companies. And at Microsoft, we sort of kicked off a lot of that because we came out with our carbon negative pledge last January. And I think a pledge is a good place to start. It gets companies to think, to put a stake in the ground, to commit to take action. But I also think Jerome makes a really good point. You're not going to solve the world by pledging alone. You've got to turn these pledges into effective action. And I would then say, if this were easy to do, it probably wouldn't be worthy of this conversation. This is hard work. It's hard work because of the measurement issue, because of nascent technology, because of the magnitude of just change. And I think it's right to say, as everyone is, because of the magnitude of inequity, not just between the global north and the global south, but even in industrial countries. You take a country like the United States and you see the adverse impact on say, people of color and different socioeconomic groups. Now, I will say, when it comes to the private sector, we need to get at it as we are. We need to hold ourselves accountable. We need to be transparent, as I think more and more companies are striving to do. As we said at Microsoft, we had reduced our emissions by 6% from 2019 to 2020. That was a good first step. It's basically a step we need to sustain every year. But I would then just back up and say, at the end of the day, the General Assembly will always be a place where governments alone get to speak and vote, but we will not solve this problem by governments acting alone or businesses acting alone or civil society acting alone. And so what we increasingly need of the UNGA meetings, the COP meetings, and elsewhere is the kind of conversation that brings us all together from around the world and from the different sectors of society that need to find new ways to work together.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you who are watching this online. Please feel free to join in our discussion, post your questions, and I'll get to as many questions as I can in just a minute. But before I do, I'd like to ask a little bit more about the pandemic and how these two sort of forces, the pandemic and climate change, have interacted. We've obviously seen that there's a logistical challenge. The pandemic poses a huge logistical challenge for the organizers of UNGA and the organizers of COP. But beyond that, the pandemic has also kind of opened up these issues and rifts over equality and justice, even exacerbated some of those issues. And Rachel, I'd like to ask you, at the end of the day, do you think COVID-19 has been a good thing or a bad thing for climate action?
Oof. The response, well, I think it gave us, it was like a little tear in the cloth. It gave us an insight into the future where we ignore threats that are right in front of us at our peril, that we can't protect ourselves if we don't protect everybody. And these are truths that we need to implement in our response to climate impacts. At the same time, we fumbled the recovery, that we had an opportunity to be bold, steer it closer towards a greener and more equitable pathway. Before the pandemic, the IMF was warning us of a failure of inclusion as being corrosive to growth and development. And we knew we needed to decarbonize, and we've kind of flubbed the recovery in the first instance, and now we've got to recover. We now have a world where everybody is warning that we've decoupled the developing world and the developed world. Richer countries may do okay and poorer countries are going to get poorer. So we've got some very profound schisms that we can't just paper over. And the response to COVID is really the same as the response to climate. We need to build inclusion within communities locally, between countries. We need a step change in the kinds of risks we're prepared to take to invest in the green infrastructure and the resilience that countries need. And we've got almost no time to do it. So it was a wake-up call, and it's up to us whether we listen. And we need political leaders, that will, back the kinds of foresight that companies like Microsoft are able to demonstrate with the new technologies. And we need to find ways to make those new technologies available to everybody quickly. So I don't know whether we're worse or better off from a climate perspective, but we've got a hole to dig out of, and we need political leadership as well as science and partnership to be able to do so.
Thank you, Rachel. And Jerome, how do you see this issue? I mean, you were one of the leaders of the youth climate youth movement and protesting. How has the pandemic intersected with your work and your advocacy for climate issues?
The pandemic has changed how the entire world works, especially now looking back at the height of it. It required that we have an evolution of thought and a revolution in how we think about solutions. When we entered into the pandemic, it showed that multiple crises can exist at the same time. We can have a pandemic that's impacting communities, but there can also be a rise in racial justice, and there can also be a rise in the climate crisis as well. That has showed that when we think about solutions and how we think about intersectionality has to change. At the very foundations of how we attack problems has to be intersectional every step of the way and inherent in how we go about framing problems. Because if we think about the climate crisis as only an issue of emissions and only an issue of reducing carbon, then we forget about the fact that climate has reeled and destroyed communities in the past. And we have to reconcile with that past before and also as we prepare for the future. We have to have a dual mindset. And that shows itself in the pandemic, especially when we think about how adults and older people have been at increased risk of the pandemic. And that is the inverse for the climate crisis. Young Americans and young people in general are at the forefront and are at the most vulnerable when it comes to the climate crisis. And what that shows is that if young people continue to had to take out of school and had to sacrifice for older generations, now as we see the climate crisis, we need to have that same approach for adults. Because if we sacrifice for you, you have to sacrifice for us as well, because we're all in this global community together. And if we're united in crisis, then we must be united in our solution. That is the biggest takeaway from the pandemic. And also when we think about intersectionality, for myself, I'm a threefold person, just as many in my generation are, because we have to be. I'm a software engineer, studying to become a software engineer, and I'm also a climate activist. And also I understand the socioeconomic aspects of the climate crisis as well. So when we think about these solutions, we can't just think about one aspect of, oh, well, we can slap a solar panel on the climate crisis and call it a day. No, we have to think about how the pandemic has shown that crises can compound upon each other and continue to exacerbate even existing social inequities.
Thank you, Jerome. So the pandemic has really kind of illuminated how some of these connections. I'd also like to ask you, I'm going to come back to you on this in a moment, how the pandemic has impacted the youth movement. I mean, 2 years ago in 2019, I think Greta Thunberg was leading a march of like 1 million people down the streets of Manhattan. And obviously here we are, it's UNGA, people aren't really there in person, and it's really changed this movement that you were very much a part of. So I'm going to come back to you on that. But Brad, first I'd like to hear from you on this question of how the pandemic has impacted climate change. Has it given us a glimpse of how we can live with lower emissions or in fact set us back?
Well, the first thing I would do is I think it behooves us to reflect on the most obvious thing that I don't think we ever talk about. COVID and climate are remarkably similar in that they both involve threats that spread through the air. One is a virus, the other are carbon molecules. And frankly, in both instances, we really would be better off without them to the degree that we are today. And then second, we've experienced the other obvious fact of life. It turns out because the wind blows, the air doesn't even recognize, much less respect borders. You can stop people from traveling and somehow viruses still manage to make their way from place to place. And yet, because the world is an uneven place in terms of development and equity, this same phenomenon that it affects us all has differential impact. So we're actually struggling with a great similarity. Now, if you step back, then I would say, well, is there any silver lining from our COVID experience that we can draw inspiration from? Well, I would also say, yes, there is. It's also equally obvious. It's the power of science. None of us 18 months ago, I think, would have dared to predict that humanity would develop not one, but multiple vaccines in less than a year. And I hope that will draw inspiration not only to use science to understand the carbon crisis, but frankly, to think about what would the equivalent of Operation Warp Speed for carbon look like. But then you get to all of the other factors that I think you've heard touched upon very well. How do you manage this uneven and unequal impact in the short run? There are, and to answer your question, yes, I think that in the short run, it has shown us that if people travel less, you can reduce emissions, and that will play a role. But I think fundamentally the future of the planet is not necessarily going to involve disconnecting different parts of the world or even asking people to travel less. We have so many bigger causes of carbon today, and we have so many better opportunities to reduce carbon emissions without, in fact, asking people to give up the things that truly help move the planet forward.
Thank you so much, Brad. So there's really some similarities between COVID and climate change. And I like your note of optimism that science can help us deal with both of those. To our audience, thank you so much for all your questions. We've got lots of questions coming in, and you can keep asking away. I will get through as many of them as I can. And since we've got so many, I'm just going to let each of you take different questions. Here is one question about UNGA, which is, what does this panel recommend to the UN to get selfish national interests to align for humanity's interest? Rachel, I'll let you take that one. And we've got another question about, does Microsoft see a possibility to develop a mobile app to give people a rough idea of their carbon footprint? Brad, I'll let you take that one. And a third question, do we not need to reduce consumption to really tackle climate change? And how do we do that in a consumerist culture? Jerome, I'll let you handle that one. So first, just to repeat, the first question is to Rachel. What does this panel recommend for the UN to get selfish national interests to align for humanity's interest?
Okay, so an incomplete answer, I think. First of all, the Secretary General's been pretty clear that we have to do the very obvious things that still aren't done. So we have to exit coal. We have to exit coal immediately. There are well-documented a few countries that are still investing in coal. They need to be helped to transition quickly. That requires new sources of funding for them to be able to access in order to do so. And that's going to require philanthropy, subsidized funding through multilateral development banks and elsewhere, and then private investment. You're beginning to see the contours of that. So we have to do that. We have to stop subsidizing the stuff we need less of. And the Secretary General's called for that. So I think there needs to be some more seriousness around that, because we still keep seeing that G7 and G20 countries are subsidizing fossil fuels in a way which is detrimental to the planet. Thirdly, the whole premise of the Paris Agreement is that we ratchet up every 5 years with more ambition. We will know next week that we are far, far off track still in terms of the plans that every country has to cut emissions. And so the UN has to call, I think, we have to speed up the clock. So the UN needs to call everybody together probably in a couple of years, and we have to ratchet again. If we're failing, we've got to go faster, we've got to go deeper. And then I think the UN has to start building up a really detailed map of how resilient countries are and what it's going to take to make them more resilient. So I think we need really detailed resilience sort of indices. Private sector can help a lot with that. And then we need to be able to apply the funds domestically and internationally to make sure that everybody can meet a standard of resilience, given what we know is going to happen with the climate impacts we've already baked into the atmosphere.
Thank you, Rachel. And Jerome, the question about consumerism and living in a consumerist culture.
Yeah, thinking about how we change consumption and consumerist culture is really a deeper question about how we change our culture. And the way that we change the global culture of consumerism is to educate. First, it's for toddlers that are educated today must see the world, must see the future and see solar powered homes and electric cars as normal. And see homes without solar panels and gas powered cars as the same as my generation sees the rotary phone. We have to have an evolution of thought and how we frame what climate is and what the necessary action must be taken. In order for us to change our culture and change how we think about how we live in this new age, in this new world, we have to make sure that we're teaching young people and teaching everyone in our culture to live in a sustainable way at every aspect of it. And another way in which we talk about consumption is, first off, we have to acknowledge the fact that in order for us to meet the moment and meet the scale, scope, and speed of the climate crisis, we can't continue to fight a system with just individual actions. What the biggest impact will have is for companies and for corporations and for governments to mandate that we now have to meet and actually have the political and moral awareness that we have to make sure that even if we aren't making profits on some things, we have to take the moral high ground. If history reminds me correctly, companies and political leaders had more moral clarity and more courage to stand up and say, even though this isn't profitable for us, we're going to take a risk and stand on the right side of history. When we talk about segregation in America, there were businesses that stood on the right side of history and made sure that Black Americans had access to food and access to the same drinking water that other people had. And if it wasn't for Black people that nearly died on Edmunds Pettus Bridge, like Congressman John Lewis, and it wasn't for the businesses that took the risk at the time of standing with morality, we wouldn't be here today, and Black people would still be hung all across America. That is the same situation we are in right now across the world. If companies and political leaders don't stand up and force the change, cultural change that we need, and socioeconomic change that we need, then we'll be in this eternal loop of reliance on fossil fuels forever. We need to have a moment where we change our culture, not just from demanding that people continue to not eat meat, but make sure that companies and elected leaders understand the pressing need for urgent and bold and courageous change all across our supply chains, all the way into whatever products or legislation we make.
Thank you, Jerome. And then Brad, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on those two questions. We also had one on whether we can expect a carbon footprint app from Microsoft.
Yeah, let me try to knit a couple of these things together. First, let me just point to one thing we all experience in day-to-day life. We can go to a grocery store, we can pick up any item before we buy it, and we can see how many calories we'll consume if we choose that product versus a competitor. I think our vision and our cause, in part, should be to have a future where you can do that for any grocery product, any product in any store, any product you look at online, and be able to easily see how much carbon was emitted in the creation of that product. And if we can create that world, then I am very hopeful that what Jerome was talking about will translate into consumer demand for products that emitted less carbon. And then you unleash the power of the market and you connect it with the force of law and regulation. So then you go to this question, can we expect a mobile app in our future? And I would say yes, but. The but is this, the app is the easy part. The real problem today is we don't have good data. And part of the challenge is if you look at how an organization really has to manage its carbon accounting today, basically it looks at all of its spending records, and it looks, for example, at how many miles or kilometers employees may have driven for trips they expensed, or how many dollars they spent on airline flights, and then they just have to compare that to an average of how much carbon was emitted for that kind of activity. But of course, what you really want for the future is differentiation. Well, if the car was an electrical powered car instead of by gasoline, that has a different level of carbon emission. If the airline invested in green fuel, then you get the credit for that. But then when you step back and you think about that, you realize how we need to standardize carbon accounting. We then need to connect all of the world's systems together. And then we need technology to knit that, not just for large organizations, but ultimately for every individual. So yes, we should have an app for that. We will have an app for that. The much bigger problem is how we create the data systems so that the app is as meaningful as it should be.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you, Jerome and Rachel. This has been a very thought-provoking discussion. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, but it's going to be a really fascinating couple of days ahead at the UN General Assembly as issues of climate action are out at the forefront in those meetings. I'm going to hand over next to my colleague, Peter Spiegel, the FT's managing editor, and he's going to discuss ending the pandemic for good. Thank you, all of you, for being here, and thanks to our audience for some very thought-provoking questions. And Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Leslie, for hosting that panel and passing it over to me. Now that you've spent 35 minutes solving the climate crisis, it's our turn to solve the pandemic. My name is Peter Spiegel. I'm the U.S. Managing Editor of the Financial Times, and thank you for joining us to talk about the pandemic ahead of UNGA. UNGA is meeting at a rather pivotal time in the pandemic. We in the developed world is frankly awash in vaccines, and slightly unexpectedly are dealing with conspiracy theories and anti-vax movements in several developed countries, and yet the developing world is still scrambling to vaccinate its populations, leading to some real conflicts on the international level. As Ed said in his introductory remarks, sometimes it feels that a pandemic should have brought us all together, but actually created new forms of nationalism and conflict. What can we do to overcome that, and are there solutions to that? I have a distinguished panel to discuss that. Let me quickly introduce them. The speaker bios are linked there on your website for longer versions, but I will give quick highlights, and I'll start with Ala Murabit, who again, has a very long list of honors in international security and health and in women's rights, but right now is the UN High-Level Commissioner for Health, Employment, and Economic Growth. Again, too many accolades and things to cite, but a couple that stood out to me. Most recently, won a distinguished fellowship, the Harvard Radcliffe Fellowship. It has also been leading the Gates Foundation Global Policy and Advocacy Health work, both very central to the current debate. The distinguished John Nkengasong, who is director of the African CDC, which is an agency as part of the AU Commission. Also, since the start of the outbreak, has been one of the WHO Director General's special envoys on COVID preparation. Again, right at the front lines of dealing with the pandemic. As an American who spent quite a bit of time in Belgium, also, I just want to pull out two things. Again, Dr. Nkengasong spent a lot of time here in Atlanta, in the US, at the US CDC, where he's also an adjunct professor at Emory, and near and dear to my heart, did most of his training in medicine in Brussels, Belgium, where my daughter was born. So that's a very, very important part of his bio. And lastly, we have Dr. Debbie Sridhar, who is joining us from Scotland, where she's a professor at the University of Edinburgh Medical School, where my grandfather did his training almost a century ago. She's also founding director of the Global Health Governance Program and is a former Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, although did her undergraduate and doctorate work at University of Miami here in the good old US of A. Let's start with the issue that I raised at the beginning, which is this odd place we're in right now, where the developed world is, if not fully vaccinated, at least coming to a point where everyone who wants a vaccine can get it. And the debate has become boosters, slightly embarrassingly, at a time when the developing world is still struggling. Dr. Nkengasong, you have been sort of at the forefront of this. I wonder if I could start with you and talk a bit about policy prescriptions here, because we've had, obviously, WHO had the COVAX program, where the developed world was supposed to be donating vaccines so that this would not happen. There's been a big debate on the international level about whether intellectual property rights are hindering development in the developing world and whether those need to be waived. Give us a snapshot of where you think we are right now in that debate, and whether you have particularly policy prescriptions that you would recommend to get us out of this place?
Thank you, Peter, for including me as part of this very distinguished panel. I don't know that I have a policy description, but if I had one, it would read like this. I would be saying, let's reset multilateralism. It has not promised, it has not lived on its promise. We need a reset button on how we govern ourselves to resolve bigger humanitarian crisis like the pandemic that we are currently facing. This is the greatest challenge of our time, and our behaviors have fallen short of the spirit and the underpinning of multilateralism, which we this week and next week, when I mean we, the collective, we as part of the United Nations, will be celebrating. One of the key functions of why we all came together, our forefathers came together in the 40s and created the United Nations, was to come together in times of crisis like this to find solutions that will be benefiting for everybody. The science that we all believe in has been incredibly generous for all of us in finding solutions for this pandemic. I would never have imagined that in 12 months, a vaccine for COVID will be identified, go through all the phases of clinical trials and get into the human arms. So let's pause and celebrate that. However, what is really appalling from where I sit is our own behaviors. We have the tools in our hands to fight and win this pandemic, but our behaviors have really fallen short of the spirit of multilateralism. So let's reset that button. At the same time, I think we must applaud the regional efforts, what I call regionalism, that has emerged from this crisis. The continent of Africa as a whole has struggled with this pandemic, but they have made use of their spirit of cooperation, the spirit of solidarity, the spirit of collaboration to fight this pandemic in a remarkable way. And I'm hope that when the history of this is written, that chapter will be remembered, that even though multilateralism fell short, in the spirit of which it was created, regionalism prevailed.
Let me ask you, Dr. Siddharth, to deal with the same question again and address some of those issues, because there are a couple of questions coming into the audience already are talking about what Dr. Nkengasong talked about, which is this sort of disappointing lack of trust that has emerged over the last 12, 18 months. Again, sort of the same question, is there a policy prescription here? Is there anything that the international community could have done, should be doing to, in some ways, sort of reduce the nationalism that has removed? And obviously, in the US, we were saddled, I guess is the word, with sort of Trumpism, which was already a very nationalist movement beforehand. But it wasn't just the US. We saw, Emmanuel Macron in France, who is one of the most leading internationalists, who also played in a little bit of vaccine nationalism in Europe and whatnot. Is there anything we could have done? Is there anything that should be done now to sort of get us back on the right path?
Well, I think what we've seen is a huge gap between the rhetoric before a vaccine became available. Think of the World Health Assembly in 2020, where leaders came together to say, even the Trump administration came together there to say, we're going to share products, we're going to do this properly, the promise of COVAX. And then actually what played out, which was rich countries acquiring the bulk of the doses, making sure they had preferential access to supply, and basically letting go of what their promises were. And while they pledged money, they didn't actually pledge doses. And you could hear from many leaders across the world saying, what use is money if you can't buy actually the good that you need to save lives, which is vaccines? I guess I'm a little bit more cynical, because we've seen this time and time again in the international community. Think of swine flu. The exact same thing happened with vaccines. Think of Ebola in 2014, when there was this chase for a cure in ZMapp or ZMatt. Again, who got it? It was certain countries which could have access to them. So I think for me, this really is a telling moment that we have to move away from the charity model of saying, please, can you donate doses? And out of your goodwill, give them. No, that model doesn't work. I think it's clearly failed. What we need is actually African countries given the capacity to manufacture their own doses. We've heard about regional manufacturing hubs, having emergency IP transfer in these kind of situations where people's lives are at stake. We've seen that happen before with the HIV pandemic, as well as, financing from the World Bank to be able to, now they're helping countries acquire doses, but build up the manufacturing capacity to to produce them. So I think right now, if we look towards the next pandemic, because this one is already raging, the real lesson for me is how do we build up those regional hubs? Because the bottleneck here is supply. The scientific process raced ahead. Scientists did this in record time, and we got the technologies and we got an effective and safe vaccine. Hesitancy, funnily enough, in those areas which have been hit hard, I mean, the States is a different situation, but look at Britain, across Europe, across countries, people want vaccines. They ran towards the vaccines, at least here in Britain. So the issue has been supply, enough doses, and that's what we need to be working on, is away from the charity model of please donate. Rich countries will never donate. I mean, I'm living one and watching boosters debates when they have to take care of their own populations. So we have to move away so every country can take care of themselves, and they have the ability to through looking at the infrastructure.
Debbie, can I push you on this? Because debate, particularly on IP transfer and manufacturing capacity, has been something that's been debated, in the international community for several months now. And the pushback you hear frequently from the private sector in particular is the traditional one. If you sort of take away our IP, you're going to get rid of the incentive for me to actually, make these things. But the other point, which I thought was more convincing, is it actually is not a manufacturing issue, that they're at capacity right now because the raw materials to come into the system are just limited. And that even if you sort of gave away our IP and suddenly magically built a new factory in the developing world, there's just a limited amount of raw materials to develop these vaccines out there, and that's not going to actually provide a solution to the current crisis, or even frankly to future crises. How would you respond to those comments from the private sector?
The first one on profit, of course, the private sector is in this for profit and there has to be enough incentive, but I think we need to have a debate over how much is enough profit. I mean, the companies have done pretty well and they're going to be doing well for years because of boosters. So I think there is a question, at what point do you say you have recouped your investment? Far beyond that, at this point, at what point does it tip over to actually being able to produce this generically can actually save lives? And I think that's just a debate we've never had. The idea of when have shareholders made enough to recoup and beyond that. And we have seen, look at Moderna stock, Pfizer stock, they've done very, very well out of this. So I think that's a tipping point, and that's a debate that also happened with HIV and ARVs and getting them out to actually save lives. On the second one is a tricky one. Yes, I mean, it's more complicated than right now. I mean, I've heard this said, if we had IP transfer still, it wouldn't result in an extra dose. I don't know if that's necessarily true, because we have seen actually manufacturing up and going in India through, Sinovac and Sinopharm and so on. So there have been attempts to do it. But of course, we have to look at the whole chain from raw materials and onwards. The main issue seems to be the issue around a business model, right? You don't want to keep factories up and running if there's no market, right? So that's been the problem, because you don't know what the next pandemic's going to be and when they're going to be used. And here's some of the discussions I've heard is, for example, Dr. Nakenga's going to know better than me, but it seems like, for example, even seasonal flu manufacturing isn't done on the continent. It's done in certain hubs. So actually, do we need to thinking about having manufacturing for seasonal illnesses that can quickly switch to pandemic illnesses, so that actually there's some way to maintain them? So there are tricky issues. There's no simple way, but I think just saying, okay, we're all going to pledge that we're going to share, we know how it's going to play out. They're not going to share when it comes time to do it. And now it's, we're seeing it now in the debate over boosters, which is a really tricky one, at least in my view as a scientist, because you're getting asked, should we be giving boosters? And in my mind, there's two separate questions, which is, scientifically, is there a boosted immune response from a third dose for vulnerable individuals, which is a scientific question, and it's an immunological question. And the second is it ethical to be giving this to individuals when there are those in the world who haven't even gotten one dose, health workers and elderly? They're two separate debates, and it's very tricky because they keep getting conflated currently. And that's kind of part of the mess where I'm like, well, actually, we can't rely on the charity model because it's breaking down.
Before I get to you, I have two quick admin things. One, we're getting questions fast and furious. If you don't know how to do the Q&A, it should be on the right of your screen in the chat section. So please use that. The other thing is, it's not your computer. We've been having video problems at the start. So I think we're back up and running. Everyone heard us. I think they were just not seeing us well, but hopefully we're back up and running. Let me ask you to sort of grapple with that, because I've been struck, and you've done a lot of work on this in sort of the geopolitics of this, and ask you, I guess maybe an unanswerable question, but I'll try anyway. This pandemic arrived at a moment when the tensions, sort of great power tensions, were almost at their peak. I mean, you did have Trumpism here in the U.S. You had Xi Jinping, who is sort of unleashed it's his own sort of unique kind of Chinese nationalism in Beijing, where they were incredibly obfuscating on origins and allowing the WHO to investigate. Obviously, Putinism in Russia. was it just bad timing to have an outbreak, or do you agree with Debbie that there's just something fundamentally nationalistic about our pandemic response, and therefore we have to stop thinking of the system as we've now built it and try to be a little bit more cynical and pragmatic about it? Well, you're on mute if you can just.
My apologies. I actually agree with both John and Debbie. There is never good timing for a pandemic. There's never good geopolitical timing, but to be very frank, our response for any security threat is always nationalistic. I mean, even when we do create alliances, even when we create multilateral institutions, they are to benefit our national interests. We can't kind of assume we're being altruistic about it, right? The difference with the pandemic is suddenly the security threat is something that we rely on each other to actually resolve. It's fundamentally different. We can't build up our own army to be the strongest. We can't sit down and negotiate with the disease. That's just not how it works. It can come through airports. It is unlike any other security threat we've had. And I would argue it's not just our geopolitical and our multilateral system that we're ill-equipped, or our vaccine production and our private-public partnerships. It's the way we do politics fundamentally. It's the same, and the best challenge, I'm glad the climate change panel was before us, a challenge that mirrors this is climate change. It's this recognition that the way in which we look at power on a political level has to shift when we have security threats that fundamentally are uncontrollable by one single nation. Now, to piggyback on the last question, I do think one of the solutions here is John leaned into regionalism a little bit. And Debbie was kind of implying it. And I think that's actually a critical point to center here. We don't have global solutions. In fact, the second, and this has been my experience with global security as a whole, when we start talking about global solutions, usually they're great ideas, but when we want to implement them, we need people on the ground, we need people regionally, we need people locally. And if we're talking about really looking at how we renegotiate that conversation with private companies, if we're talking about looking at local production, et cetera, what we really need is some way to work with one another to create transparent global production planning. We need regulatory coordination. We do need that sharing of vaccine doses. Yes, governments will not, the charity model doesn't work, but we need stopgap measures in the meantime, because there is such an inequality that is beginning to happen across vaccine allocation right now. So even if it was some sort of global dashboard where you could see that production and availability, where you could work together across borders to remove any barriers, any logistical barriers, I do think that's critical. But it begs the question of the long term, because it does look like COVID will become endemic. And that long-term question, I think, is one that does sit at a regional and national level a lot more. We do need to ensure that countries have the agency to respond to pandemics locally. And this is, whether we want to talk about it or not, at the end of the day, this is not about IP or production power, et cetera. This is fundamentally about power. It is not a global health issue. It is a global power conversation. How much are we willing to allow, and especially in the way in which we do politics, how much are we willing to permit one another to create different avenues of power? That's what this is.
John, can I ask you to address that? Because it is, the issue of agency is directly tied to the ability to manufacture. How critical do you think it is for Africa in particular to develop its own manufacturing capacity on vaccines? But since you've done a lot of work with the WHO, I wonder if you could address that as well, because there obviously was, just for political reasons, a lot of rhetoric coming out of Washington when Trump was president about the big bad WHO. But there even some less, shall we say, partisan critics have been very, very critical of how the WHO dealt with the early stages of the pandemic, how they've dealt with China on this. Is there a need for again, trying to put Trump aside, is there actually a need for some reform of the WHO and the international level? Or is this something that you also agree that everyone's getting a little bit cynical here, and we need sort of more pragmatic regional solutions to tackle the next pandemic, or even the COVID phase 3.0, or whatever the next phase is?
No, thank you, Peter. And let me again just continue with Alad ended, I think, which she touched on very key points, as well as what Sridhar mentioned earlier. I think we need to take our overall health security apparatus that was set put in place in the mid-1940s, precisely around 1947. Look at it in the eyes and ask yourself the question if that is still the right security apparatus for the world, health security apparatus for the world. I can imagine easily, very crudely, that a house that I built about 75 years ago is no longer the house that I need today, or a road that I built 75 years ago, it definitely needs to be repaired. And that is not, when I say this, people hear different things. But what I'm saying clearly is that the health security apparatus of the world was set up in a way that regions like where I sit had to depend on there was dependency on others for your own security, and it cannot. A people of 1.3 billion cannot continue to be the moral scar in people's moral conscience when a pandemic happens. The HIV, I was in Cote d'Ivoire working for the US CDC when ARV drugs were available. It took 10 years before they got widely used in Africa. 10 million Africans died. Have we forgotten about that? Memory is very short. I mean, people don't even talk about it, but which was, to me, they died unnecessarily. And I think Devi or Allah mentioned the swine flu of 2009. So we've seen this over and over. Our behavior during this pandemic has been really nothing that we should be proud of. Okay, because we have the tools. I mean, it was true for diagnostics when we just started. Remember, the far cry was Africa needs diagnostics. I wrote several commentaries there, including in Nature, worldviews about let Africa into the diagnostic market. Nothing. Okay, but we are fighting a pandemic. Then vaccines. We started warning last year, even before vaccines were available. And I think, as David mentioned, we said all the right things in the pulpit. Everybody said the right thing. Timely access, equity, and everybody. When the vaccines became available, we forwarded inward and took care of our own selves, not knowing that, I mean, that is not the solution for a pandemic. And this virus is challenging us in a way that, and I agree, we are heading towards endemicity. Let us just be courageous and admit that. I mean, our only failure would truly be the failure to admit that we have failed collectively and we are heading towards endemicity. See what happens in Israel. Israel was here as a country that vaccinated very quickly, and we're all happy. The United States have moved forward, but see what is happening. The variants came in and challenged that, and now we're rushing back to the drawing board and without science saying we need boosters. Let's just boost our way. So we are dealing with about 6 different kinds of vaccines out there. Since when have we seen the evidence that this immunity wanes similarly across all 6 vaccines we are using? We don't know that. We don't know that. Where is the evidence to show that if your immunity, your neutralizing antibodies go below a certain level, you are more at risk to progress to disease, severe disease, and hospitalization? We don't know. If we boost now, I mean, I got my vaccines in my last dose of vaccines in March. And so should I get one now? And then afterward, how soon should I get another one? We don't know. So we are just, we rush into this just because, again, we've refused to modify our behaviors, to adapt our responses to the reality of time, and to say that we are so much blessed that we are fighting a pandemic 100 years later compared to 1918 with a lot of tools. Those who fought and won the pandemic in 1918 had none of the tools that we had. They actually knew what they were dealing with after the pandemic was over. Okay, but they were successful, they were brave, they were resilient. I'm sure they worked together. We have the tools, but our behaviors have just completely been nothing that we should be proud of. So I think I agree that a couple of things. As a continent, I speak from where I sit, we need an entire new public health order and be very bold and unapologetic about that, which says we have to manufacture vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics. We have to strengthen our own institutions, public health institutions, including regional bodies like the Africa CDC, that the head of states believe in now completely. I've had the chance to brief them about 16 times since this pandemic. I mean, that is remarkable for the region. We need to make sure that we develop our own workforce capacity, capital, so that you can co-create intellectual property. I hear the discussion about transfer of technology. My worry is that it creates another stigma that it says that our young people should sit, fold their hands and wait for technology to be developed in China, India, or United States, and then transfer it to us. That is not what the conversation that we should be having. Again, when the current health security architectures were put in place, as a continent, we were about 300 million people as a continent. Today, we are 1.4 billion, heading to 2.4 billion in the next 30 years. So young people, let's put in place as a continent our demographic dividends and make them do the research, develop property and begin to. That doesn't solve the problem today, but it should solve the problem for tomorrow.
John, can I push you on that? Because I know you might have to leave to catch a flight, but just to push you on this, because up until the pandemic, Africa was almost one of the few good news stories globally, in that Millennial Development Goals. I mean, we started to hear that capacity building in Africa was starting to reach the point that we had all hoped it would, and that there was the self-sustaining and whatnot. And there is a lot of concern. I've heard this from the Rockefeller Foundation and others who have said, boy, this has been a setback. I mean, we have gone back to almost pre-development, pre-millennial development levels. And partly it's getting worse because the developed world is vaccinated and the economies are booming. How concerned are you? I mean, you were sort of admonishing the young people of a continent of almost 2 billion people to sort of look inwardly. But are you worried at all that this pandemic in particular will set back capacity to actually deal with it, Africa, deal with it on its own?
No, absolutely. No doubt about that. Again, I've said many times that this is a generational issue. We fought for generations and generations to come. There are whole segments of young people that are not going to school because of this pandemic, disrupting education. Education is the foundation of everything else that we are discussing here. Whether we have good epidemiologists, good researchers, and whatever, it's all about the foundation is the good education there. It is setting back tremendously our economy. Each time we see these waves, I mean, Africa is going through the third wave. I think a few countries are now going through the fourth wave. The impact on the economy is huge. And you cannot rebuild back better, bigger and bolder with a weak economy. And we are going to see that. We are beginning to see national security threats from this pandemic. I mean, the national security threat, I underline the word national security threat from this pandemic. So the continent is, and don't forget that the endemic diseases have not gone away. The HIV, the TB, the malaria, that we were on a very nice trajectory and now will come back and strongly. Testing has fallen by 40% for some of these diseases. And I think that is the big challenge. So we are really in for a long haul. I said at the start of this pandemic that this is an existential crisis for the continent, and it's almost 18 months into it. I still believe strongly that it is, and especially given the nature of how this virus is evolving. We started off believing that with vaccines, we'll probably get to 60% immunization and create herd immunity. Gone. Throw it out of the window. We're not going to do that. Now, our strategy has to be, how do you vaccinate everybody? Because the vaccine now, we are using it now as semi-therapy, okay, which means it's, if John or Debbie are healthy, you get your vaccine with the hope that when you get infected, your severity of the disease will be less and you will not go to the hospital. So that is now using it as semi-therapy, not trying to prevent a transmission of the virus. We now know that even with the vaccine, you can be infected and you can transmit, and that you'll be sick and whoever is receiving it. So that has to change, which means that instead of thinking of vaccinating 50% to create barrier, we're doing this for a long time. And we are 3.5% fully vaccination. That is why I said that there's absolutely no way that we should not be thinking of this as an acute pandemic. I mean, the acute phase is gone. I mean, as Africa, I will be advising the continent to put this into your long-term strategy of herd defenses and respond for the continent together with the other challenges.
3.5%. It's worth remembering that. Debbie, let me turn to you because you very helpfully helped us frame the conversation in your first remarks. But if I could just push you again on this issue that I talked to John about, which is if we are agreeing that the solution has to be more regional and less sort of Bretton Woods 1940s international, what do you do about the fact that we are sliding backwards in the developing world over the last 2 years during the pandemic in capacity building? How do you address that? Because if your solutions are regional manufacturing hubs and transfer IP at a time where suddenly, as John said, Africa and other developing regions are losing and falling back in education, falling back on some of these other development goals. How do you match that? And is there a way to deal with that?
I mean, it's hard to have an easy solution to this. This is a massive problem. And as John has said, I mean, look at even in where we are in Scotland, and you vaccinate over 90% of your population and you're still having transmission, and you're still having hospitals filling up with the people who are unvaccinated, because this virus just seems to jump and cause such high levels of hospitalization that even in this context is difficult. And then you think of going into a low-income context where you only have 3.5% coverage, much less health resources, and then the issue of schools closures and all the rest of it. I think it's exactly right. I mean, there was a hope with Israel when we saw those rates and numbers coming down and they had 0 cases, that we could reach some idea of herd immunity, a threshold where we could stop circulation of the virus. And that provided hope, because you could say there's a way through this, given how we've managed measles, given how we've managed other diseases. Where I think now we're looking at this as a chronic issue that we're going to be living with. And the hope is that we don't see a more difficult variant than Delta. I mean, Delta is pretty horrific. I don't think any of us anticipated that we would have a virus become more than two times more transmissible within the course of 18 months. And it has gone into countries, I'm thinking of even Senegal, which did so well in its first wave. But how do you deal with a virus that keeps coming back in a form that's more and more challenging to suppress, and the tools you used before don't use again? So I think, again, as you know, I can't add much more there, but working with institutions like the World Bank that can provide comprehensive financial packages and saying, look at holistically, you know, across the spectrum of health, how do we keep our measles vaccination campaigns going? How do we keep schools moving? How do we make sure we don't slide behind on polio, which is now showing a resurgence? How do we keep going with those other agendas and manage COVID as best we can, though it's given that it's unlikely to be something where you could just throw everything at it and it goes away. It's going to be here for a while, and it's going to be causing huge devastation. I guess my one plea would be around schools, where I think across the world we saw school closures and, you know, schools shut. I mean, I was just listening to a meeting in Kerala in India where schools have been shut for almost 18 months. Can you imagine, kids and not in in-person learning? And I know in the United States, kids have been out of school as well, depending on what state you're in, or in Zoom school. Big problem for kids who don't have Wi-Fi. We need to get schools back into in-person learning and figure out how we get back to kind of the basic building blocks of building our society: education, jobs, development, while managing COVID at the same time. And it's a tricky one, but I think we have to move beyond blanket shutdowns and lockdowns, because we can't do that indefinitely now. We have to use vaccines and therapeutics to find our way through.
Well, as the father of 2 young children, I say amen to that. I'm going to give you, we're running out of time here. I want to give you sort of almost the last word here as sort of the representative of the UN, the head of UNGA, because I worry slightly this conversation has focused a lot on regional solutions, and I want to take it back to the international community, because obviously that's what the UN is. Can you address, I mean, both John in particular has talked about revamping sort of our Bretton Woods 1940s era way we approach these things. Just to tackle that, but also sort of, can you address where you think, if we were to, you know, we have 6 months from now, we would gather this group back together, what would you like to see the international community do in the next 6 months? What is the role for the international community if we take Debbie's solutions to heart, which is we need it to be more practical and more regional? What then becomes the role for the WHO and the UN and the international community?
No, I hear you. So I don't think it's an either or in terms of regional or global. I think it's a both and. I do think multilateral institutions are critical to creating that clarity and urgency, but also coordination. I think that the issue becomes when we anticipate that the global community is going to prioritize global interests over national interests. That I don't think is realistic. What I do think is realistic is that we can coordinate national interests across the world. And so having things like, you know, envoys for COVID, having clarity and sharing around, you know, different vaccine production, distribution, working with each other to reduce a lot of those barriers, you know, I think that's very critical in the short and in the long term, to be frank. It does shift us away from looking at the multilateral institutions like the WHO and the UN as the solution bearers, and rather people who can bring together those leading in their respective regions and continents, like John, to the table saying, okay, what's working for you, what isn't working for you, so that there is more of that sharing and partnership. I do think that's a critical role for the multilateral institutions. The other thing I'll add on, and Debbie mentioned the World Bank in terms of financing. I think financing vaccines is critical. It's hypercritical. I also think we need to recognize the impact. I mean, we talk a lot about supply chains when it comes to private businesses and things like car manufacturing and computers and how they've been hit by COVID. But the supply chain, when it comes to a human level, when we're talking about things like, increased misinformation and disinformation, when we're talking about a huge reduction in women's rights and girls' education, when we're looking at economic plummets, what we're talking about as a whole is an increased likelihood of internal and regional conflict. And we need to ensure that our multilateral systems, which have really been critical in maintaining regional stability and global stability in the past, not always at 100%, but have been critical partners, really need to be prepared for the aftermath of COVID while COVID still exists. We all talk about a post-COVID world. That's not going to happen. So how can we start working on those parallel impacts? How do we work on girls' education? How do we work on women's rights? How do we work on economic fallout while still battling the pandemic itself? And I think there is definitely a regional, national, and global play there where we can start looking at that pie and say, this is way too overwhelming and big for any one country, anyone, the African Union alone, Senegal alone will not be able to do this. How do we do this collectively? Who addresses which piece of that pie is pretty critical. But I think that impact on a human level is somewhere where the UN is going to have to come in, along with other multilateral partners, quite strongly.
And it's going to have to take coordination. Can I ask just one question on this? Because, it's been a theme that's run through this conversation, and the question just popped up in my inbox, which is the trust deficit. And I come from a more traditional national security background when I was a reporter, and there were always these phrases about trust building exercises where, the Israelis and the Palestinians or other organizations, when they talk about peace deals, there is sort of these slowly step. Is that something we need now? I mean, the bad blood seems to be so bad right now amongst some of the major players. Again, the U.S.-China thing is the most obvious, but I don't think it's just U.S.-China. Is to get to where you're advocating, which is coordination on an international level, but also a role for regional and national. Do we need something soon where we start doing a little bit of trust rebuilding? And if so, I don't know, how do you think we could do that?
So my very oversimplified answer for you is yes. Ask me about execution and implementation, and we can't really move farther unless we have the people in those rooms. The reason I say yes, though, is because we're at a point where, you mentioned Israel and Palestine. That's an excellent example of where who are the stakeholders in this conversation. With this pandemic, we're at a fundamentally different point. Everybody is a stakeholder. Anybody with a cell phone is a stakeholder. Governments are, private companies are, and there is such little clarity around what is actually correct. John and Debbie both kind of delved into the debate around boosters. Overnight, news stations and politicians were talking about boosters, and a lot of doctors and scientists were like, wait a second, what? We haven't actually assessed if this is necessary, but that became the topic of conversation. And so I do think, I think there's a need to really look at how we build trust, but also, quite frankly, what are we doing about the information that is out there? And how can we regulate information, or at least create greater clarity around what is legitimate and what is not? And that is, as somebody mentioned, the 1918 flu. That's one of, I think, the biggest and most critical differences, very frankly. Yes, we're scientifically much more advanced, but my goodness, we can communicate, and everybody has, the ability to have a platform. And that has, I think, spurned a lot of the challenges in terms of, in the US and in many other countries, a lot of the challenges around, do we prioritize a global engagement before we look at our own national interests? Do we actually, donate vaccines, or do we fully finance vaccines? A lot of these conversations have a hint, and not just a hint, have a strong dose of misinformation attached where people don't necessarily know. And I think that's a thing we need to address.
It's amazing to me. Here we are 18 months, almost 2 years into this, and yet still the science seems to be trumped by the politics. And I don't even mean disinformation, because the debate about boosters is being promulgated by rather mainstream politicians, and the scientists are quite grumpy about this.
But that's something that we've seen across global security historically, right?
Fair point.
Trumped by the politics. I think why it's so critically different here is because the facts here are what actually make up life and death. You can't build up a military, and we go, even in this conversation, we go straight to production because that's what we know. Right? We're like, okay, well, how do we build up our infrastructure? How can we actually build up our army against this? When the reality is, let's say we build those manufacturing plants, we share IP, et cetera. We're still going to be probably in a very similar position as we are in today, because it's that human nature component that we are not addressing.
on that optimistic note, I'm getting the hook from our organizers. Thank you very much to the panel for this really, really stimulating, if somewhat depressing, discussion about tackling COVID and the pandemic, and hopefully this time next year, when UNGA meets again, we'll be all in person and we'll be not dealing with another variant. I'm going to pass it over to my good friend and the host of this entire event, Ed Luce, who is our national editor based in Washington, for a panel to wrap this all together, try to figure out how climate and COVID and the other international crises we're facing, how the international community can get together next week and solve all of them. I'm sure it'll be a very easy one. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Peter Spiegel, although I note you did run a little bit over length, for a very bracing panel. Both panels were indeed very bracing, the first on climate, the second on COVID. Bracing because we clearly haven't seen the kind of international cooperation over the pandemic that might presage a better cooperation over climate, or indeed future pandemics. And that's really the sort of first takeaway I have from these two panels. And the second is, and we're going to get into both of these, but the second is that the gap between what the West pledges, whether it be on vaccine distribution or on climate finance, remains as wide as ever. And that's something that maybe a year ago we wouldn't have predicted, given some of the early expectations around global cooperation with this pandemic. So we're going to focus in this panel, this concluding panel, on solutions and finding common ground and how to fix this fractured world that the first two panels elucidated so well. And with me is a really wonderful panel. We have Elizabeth Cousins, who's of course the host of this event, the head of the UN Foundation. We have Nanjala Nibala, and correct me, Nanjala, if I've mispronounced your last name, who is a Nairobi-based writer and activist, and very, very well qualified to give a developing world perspective on both of these big themes. And Nari Woods, head of the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford, and a chair of economic governance at Oxford University. So welcome to all three of you. Let me start, Elizabeth, with you, and ask you, what is it that we have learned from some of the failures we've just been hearing over COVID? And we can get on to the sort of warp speed kind of successes later. But what have we learned from what's gone wrong in the last 18 months about how we can better tackle future pandemics and indeed global warming?
Well, thank you, Ed. It is delightful to be here with you and with Nanjala and Nairi, and to follow two such provocative panels. Let me step back just a minute. We are at a profound turning point. We have to decide whether we're prepared as societies, as a global community, to cooperate and in new ways to solve challenges like climate and like COVID that are right on our doorstep, or whether we don't. John and Kangasong made that point extremely clearly in the last panel. The biggest threats we face today, whether it's COVID or climate change, are transnational. A virus does not respect borders, neither do greenhouse gas emissions. You know, the rising assault on science that we all talk about that threatens every single one of our societies, that doesn't stop at borders either. So we are connected in our vulnerability to these kinds of threats, and we absolutely need reinvigorated cooperation to deal with them. So COVID-19 absolutely is the wake-up call everybody talks about. It's a test, and we aren't passing it yet. And we know there are even bigger tests to come, obviously, including climate change. I will say, I think there are bright spots. You know, there are bright spots in the leadership of cities and governors and businesses that are moving faster on things like climate than many governments. There are innovations in some of the international capacities we have to deal with global health threats, some of which came up in the last panel. And there is especially an incredibly powerful demand from so many quarters and rising impatience and even anger that the most powerful countries deliver on their promises, deliver on equity, and that is an opportunity for leadership that is before every leader in the world today. So, to me, there's no alternative to cooperation in an interconnected world. Solidarity is self-interest, and that is very much the choice before us today.
So, I mean, very important, point there, distinction between what you pledge and what you deliver. And I think that's most keenly felt in countries such as Kenya around the world. Nanjala, the same question to you. What has the last 18 months, and bearing in mind Elizabeth's remarks, what has the last 18 months taught you about how we can improve going forward?
I think one of the interesting things for me has been the inability to pay attention to the successes and to invest in the successes. I think one of the big tragedies that has really emerged has been that because of the concentration of resources, whether we're talking about vaccines, whether we're talking about public health professionals, research, etc., we're very attuned to paying attention to where things are going wrong. And that's good, and it's legitimate because we want to fix those things and we want to address those things. But there are successes that have been happening in other parts of the world that have kind of gone under the radar, and failing to invest in them means that we compound the challenges that are coming down the pipeline. So one very quick example, and Dr. Nkengasong really has talked about this in multiple fora, has been the acceleration of access to testing capacity, access to just the raw materials of the frontline materials of containing the virus, whether we're talking about testing, whether we're talking about tracking, whether we're talking about networks of information. In the African continent, we went from having zero testing capacity in January 2020 to every single country in Africa having testing capacity by the end of March. That's a tremendous acceleration in raw materials and organization, in investment in infrastructure that happened over a 3-month period because of the kind of partnerships that we want to scale up. The kind of partnerships that we want, whether we're talking about the Africa Vaccine Acquisition Task Force, whether we're talking about the Africa CDC, whether we're talking about regional cooperation at the African Union level, those are the kind of successes that we want to see rolled out in different ways around the world or scaled up in Africa. And so for me, it's from a cognitive perspective, from an ideational perspective, is wanting to see us be better at identifying successes, investing in successes, boosting their capacity, amplifying the work that's being done so that we're not just able to perceive what's going wrong, but also able to perceive what's going right and respond to it accordingly.
Nari, it strikes me from both of those opening statements that the gap that we're talking about between pledge and delivery is going to be exacerbated by what is maybe 5, 10, 15 years of fallback in development, of loss of Millennium Development Goals because of the economic hit to poorer countries from this pandemic. As you answer the same question that the first two have answered, could you incorporate that as a factor? Because we're not looking at the same numbers that we were looking at 18 months ago in terms of Millennium Development achievements in the developing world.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And something that I think people miss when we look at that lost generation, that's going to result from COVID, the number of kids who have been out of school for 2 years that don't have access to Wi-Fi, that don't have a Zoom classroom, even if a Zoom classroom were to work. The untreated diseases that are resulting as a cause of the focus on COVID. That does mean, as you say, Ed, that progress towards the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, has been really set back. I would want to add to that, to what you said, the fact that the United States, the United Kingdom, European countries have been the super spreaders of COVID. That there's a lot of attention now to what it is that poor countries need to do. And there's a lot of attention about what international organizations need to do. But some work that we've done here at Oxford at the Blavatnik School shows that actually the infections in New York did not come from China. They actually came from Europe. That the measures that countries that have so many flights coming in and out of took immediately when the virus began, their failure to control people leaving their countries with virus meant that the virus spread very, very quickly. And I think there is a responsibility on those wealthy countries that are so hyper-connected, that were the super spreaders of COVID, to take responsibility for that, not to do it next time, and to accept that their failure to slow the spread of the disease hugely increased the burden on poorest countries. So there's an additional responsibility there. But I think there's two other failures that I think are worth pondering on, because they're real opportunities for improvement. And one is that even in the wealthiest countries, there was what COVID showed us was that there is not enough connective tissue between London and the different devolved governments and local governments of Britain, between Washington, DC and the different states of the United States, between Delhi and the rest of the country, that there was almost no capacity in a crisis for them to share information, to share resources, and to share decisions. And if you can't do that on something that requires so much local action, you cannot govern. You can't even govern within your own country, let alone cooperate with others. And I think that's important for us to learn, not just for the next pandemic, but also for climate change, that we've got to build connective tissue within our own countries. And then I guess the other surprising thing is that COVID has created phase after phase of uncertainty. And countries have, in my view, been almost unable to learn from other countries in a timely, immediate way. We launched this Oxford Government Response Tracker at the school. And what that tells us, is it tracks every government's response to each phase of COVID, is that governments tend rather blindly to follow other governments that they have some reason to admire, instead of asking, hold on, who's getting this phase of the crisis right? What are they doing? How do we actually mimic them? That there's a reluctance on the part of Europeans to say we should be doing what China's doing, and instead a desire to look at their neighbors and say, well, let's just copy our neighbor, even when that's not working. So I think a real opportunity to learn much faster from people succeeding if we face an uncertain crisis, and a real need for those who spread the crisis so quickly to take additional responsibility for the additional burden they've put on some of the poorest countries of the world.
That's a very interesting point, and particularly the last point you just reiterated, which is I think the first you made. The analogy there that strikes me is between the West being super spreaders of this, and therefore bearing a huge responsibility for its impact in the developing world, and the stock of carbon that's out there, which is dominantly hitherto come from the West, perhaps not going forward. Let's just sort of get to more of the solutions, because when you confront topics like this, you can talk yourself, up to a suicidal ledge, and there are solutions. Multilateralism. Donald Rumsfeld, the late Donald Rumsfeld, once notoriously said, you go to war with the army you have. Well, we've got the multilateralism we have. How can we reimagine it, Elizabeth? How can we improve it? I believe UN Secretary General Guterres is, with his common agenda, trying to reimagine multilateralism. And I know you've been part of that conversation. How would that look?
Well, great question, and I'll come to it, but I actually want to follow up first on Nanjala's point before, because we've done some recent modeling. It very much follows also on John and Kangasong's point about prior investments that have been made in global health over the last 20 years and how that's impacted COVID response today. And the modeling shows that all of the different investments that have been made in the global health field over the last 20 years, some of them around the MDGs that you mentioned, some of them after, a whole range of innovations. Had it not been for those, if COVID had happened in the year 2000, instead of in 2020, the total death toll would have been 2 to 3 times higher. Global GDP losses would have been $3 trillion higher, and even very modest additional delays in detection, diagnostics, disease control, and above all, vaccine development, which we've been talking about, would have made the pandemic even more devastating. So I mention all of that just to say there have been actually important advances Some of them are at great risk of backsliding, as you've talked about, with respect to development gains as well, but important investments and advances that it's worth remembering when we think about a future that looks very stark and a bit frightening, because that's part of what we need to draw on. So you asked about the Secretary General's thinking about the future of multilateralism. He's been talking for some time, as have been many academics and activists around the world, about the need for multilateralism to be stronger, but to change. And it needs to change in particular to be more networked and inclusive. So that relates to some of the conversation we were having before about regional solutions. A networked multilateralism doesn't have the UN doing everything from the top down. It has the UN doing things that make sense for the UN, but working very much in collaborative partnership with different nodes of expertise, capacity, leadership in different parts of the world and in different sectors. That's enormously important, not only because that's where the capabilities are and that's where people should be able to design the solutions that make sense for them, but also it builds resilience. We all know that networks are either fragile or they're resilient, and that's a lot of what we need in the world today. So he has a very bold vision in this Common Agenda report. Uniquely, he asked a group of young people to work with their counterparts around the world and produce a shadow report. It's called Our Future Agenda. It's really powerful. They're both great reads together. I really recommend that people read them. You won't agree with everything, and I suspect on this panel we'd have a good debate about how we feel about the different proposals in them, but it's a really ambitious agenda. It's a very urgent agenda, and it recognizes exactly what we've been talking about for the last 2 hours, which is that the single greatest test before all of us is whether we can rise above our differences, our inertias, our limitations, and realize that we face common threats that we absolutely depend on each other to solve. There is no alternative to that. And climate and COVID are just the absolutely perfect exemplars of that, but they're not unique, frankly. So that is the challenge before us. And I think, to figure out more imaginative ways of conducting the business of finding common interest. We're not all going to like each other when we do that, but we do have interests in common that we need to find a way to work together on, because otherwise, the future does look very bleak. But I think there's the prospect of the alternative.
Can I just press you, Elizabeth, for one or two specifics on what that reimagining multilateralism looks like? Because, clearly if we've learned anything about multilateralism over the last year, it's that if the US and China don't agree with each other, very, very little can get done. How do you get around that?
Well, I think it's a number of different pieces, and there are a lot of proposals in this report, so I can't begin to summarize all of them, but it includes creating platforms for different nodes of leadership, for other countries to lead, for different institutions to have greater leadership. It includes building in very different capabilities for shared strategic analysis, foresight analysis, and planning for different future trends. Those are some of the issues that Nairi was just speaking about. It includes really strenuous proposals for how to think differently about accountability. Some of the questions that have been coming up about promises made and not delivered. Includes a lot of ideas about how to build greater equity into not just international systems, but national systems as the kind of core basis for renewing trust between people and their governments, which we all know is at a very low ebb in most places around the world. So, and I don't think it's starry-eyed about the geostrategic challenges and tensions that can create incredible limits on the ability of others to cooperate. It sort of names it and then poses a challenge for us to try to find creative ways of working around and within that.
So, Nanjala, I saw you shaking your head as I mentioned, when the US and China don't agree, then cooperation's hard. And I think that head shaking was fully deserved. I'm very conscious of the fact that perspectives such as yours and perspectives from other countries are overlooked. And that you in your first answer gave a wonderful example of how Africa did achieve something pretty early into the pandemic that might not have been predicted. Elizabeth just mentioned what the health improvements in our systems since 2000 have done to lessen this pandemic from something that would have been even more horrific. Can you give some examples from where you're sitting as to how to reimagine multilateralism?
Yeah, and I'm going to put something on the table that I think makes a lot of people very uncomfortable, but I think it's really urgent and important. I think that the future of multilateralism lies in decentering the West and decentering China. I think that there are more countries in the world that have interests that are not necessarily, and this is a very Bandung sort of approach to let's find a third way. Because I think the assumption, for example, and I think Larry pointed to this, that the West knew what it was doing, or Europe especially knew what it was doing when it came to COVID, is part of the reason why so many African countries are now in a mess. Keeping the borders open because the UK asked them to, keeping tourism going because European countries asked them to, and now we have a situation where we are not only facing this deadly virus and disease, but we're facing it without the support of the countries that asked us to keep the borders open, that asked us to keep these population circulations going. And so I really do think that we need a Bandung conference approach to this for the rest of the world, because we have to survive. And if we keep our survival contingent on what China is doing and what the West is doing and what China is fighting about and what the West is fighting about, we're not going to survive. That's the uncomfortable truth. Look at Afghanistan. The idea that the solutions must come from the countries that have economic power, I think this pandemic has shown us that is deeply flawed. I think that African countries have been a standout success when it comes to regional coordination during this pandemic. I think at the national level, there are so many flaws that are happening, and Kenya is a great example of how national policy fails to implement ideas that have been developed by policymakers, practitioners working at a regional level who don't have that domestic biases and the domestic sort of, they're not hamstrung domestically the way the domestic policymakers are. The success of the Africa CDC is born out of the 2014 Ebola outbreak. It was a realization that there was no pandemic level sort of predictive capacity, coordination capacity on the continent. And so the fact that the Africa CDC is doing as well as it is right now is an example of what Naira was talking about, learning, consolidating lessons and building institutions so that the next crisis isn't as bad as the previous crisis. That level of success falls short when it is, it's made beholden to the pre-existing assumptions about who has knowledge, who has our best interests at heart, that we're falling into these tropes and these assumptions about where solutions will come from that practice shows us isn't always necessarily the case. So I really do think that for African countries, for Latin American countries, for Asian countries, our medium-term, long-term success comes from decoupling ourselves and sort of getting off this idea that we must always have our interests subservient or secondary to what powerful countries are doing. And I think that the stakes, when we're talking about climate change on this panel, I think the stakes couldn't be higher. We're talking about, I've been thinking a lot about plastic waste recently because it's tied into some other work that I'm doing. And when we look at just this very simple issue whereby international cooperation could actually solve so many problems, but instead what we're seeing is shifting the burden, as we're talking about on this panel, instead of fixing the problem at national level, at regional level in the West, we are selling our waste to poorer countries and making it their problem without there being that transfer of capacity, without there being that transfer of knowledge. That's the kind of multilateralism that we want to see end. And we want to start thinking, well, as Naira said, can you take responsibility for your part of the error, of your part of the problem, and work in a way that recognizes that other people's survival interest is more important than geopolitical, consolidating your geopolitical position. The reason why vaccines are being hoarded, the reasons why we're being told that we can't get the formulae for producing these vaccines is because of the idea that the geopolitical survival of rich countries is more important than the life or death survival of poor countries. And that's why I would really put this radical idea on the table is, what does inclusive and just multilateralism that isn't centered on the geopolitical survival of rich countries look like? I think that's the urgent question, because the status quo is life or death for so many people. And I just don't necessarily think that the people who have power in the current system understand the risk that way.
That's very adequately and forcefully put. How to work around the geopolitical sort of predominance of the competition between China and the West. how do we do this? Nari, talk of expanding, just to stick within the multilateral sort of system we've got for a moment, talk of expanding the veto-wielding membership of the UN Security Council has been around for decades. Nothing, of course, has happened because it would require the incumbents to agree to dilute their power. So having, Nigeria or Kenya or whoever, or a rotating African member, ditto for Latin America. Is that part of how you reimagine multilateralism? How do you overcome the geopolitical sort of dominance of bandwidth that Nanjala has just elucidated?
Well, look, I think you've got to start with a shift in mindset. We still live in a world order that that one group of countries feel was theirs, that they forged a set of rules for open market capitalist competition and then encouraged everybody else to play that by their rules. And that system, that international system of rules applied by a number of different institutions, has three huge problems now. And the first is that the very people within those countries, within the United States, within Britain, and within the countries of Europe, don't like those rules anymore. There's a backlash against them. The people wanting to continue to support those rules are being voted out. The second problem is that system underpinned by US leadership, the US is no longer willing to lead. And the third problem is that a lot of countries are looking at the way China is resolving problems and saying, which sets of solutions do we want? They see China taking on three big problems: climate, technology monopolies, and inequality. And you've got a Chinese leadership that we might not like the solutions being proposed, but it's taking on those problems and it's shining a light on the fact that our governments are not and don't seem to even be at the beginning of a solution. So in that world, what will multilateralism look like? Well, I take a slightly more geopolitically anchored view, I think, than Nanjala. I mean, I love your spirit of Bandung, but what I see emerging is the international organizations will keep staggering on and they'll be useful for some things. I think the IMF's done quite well on COVID with its SDR allocation and such like. And China and the United States and other countries will continue to vie for power within them. But we're also going to see multilateralism emerge in the China bloc and in the US bloc. And we're already seeing that happen with each side creating their own institutions. That's not a bad thing. If you're a developing country or you're a small country, it does give you a few choices and it does give you some possibility of negotiating what the rules within your own alliance are. And third, we are going to see more ad hoc cooperation, the kind of not just G20, but back to the old concert of Europe, where great powers will necessarily find that on climate, on terrorism, on territories that are fragile and conflict-ridden, on health sometimes, that they actually have overlapping interests and they will turn to each other to resolve those interests, even as they continue having conflict on others. So I'm an optimistic realist. I think that multilateralism will continue in those different things. And the trick for all smaller countries in the system is to play those three levels of multilateralism.
Again, a fascinating, thought-provoking answer. We are, I should mention, we are fairly limited for time and there are questions coming in and I will move to those in a minute, but let me do before then a sort of another round of questions. And Elizabeth, starting with you, I just wanted to get into the specifics at the other end of the geopolitical spectrum, your country, the United States. And we have a Biden administration that says America's back after the turbulence and PTSD of the Trump years. We have at the same time an IMF that Larry mentioned that says it'll cost $50–60 billion to vaccinate 60% of the world by mid-2022, but Biden isn't yet there. Now, I might be, disproved next week. He is holding an international summit next week to coincide with UNGA on the pandemic, and we might see bigger vaccine pledges. But right now, as it stands, Biden is proposing to spend more on upgrading Amtrak than he is on global vaccines. If with a democratic and internationalist administration, we're having this much trouble politically in demonstrating the one-worldedness of a pandemic and indeed of global warming, what else needs to happen before America resumes, as we hope, a leadership role?
Well, there's so much to say, both in response to your question and to the remarkable conversation we've had so far. I do want to pick up one point connecting your question and a point Nairi made. I'm always loath to disagree with the remarkable Nairi Woods, but I do think that the reason that we had Donald Trump elected to the US presidency was not because Americans rejected international cooperation. We've been doing bipartisan polling for 20 years, remarkably consistent and strong bipartisan support for US engagement in the world, believing the UN has value. The UN actually rates higher as an institution on a bipartisan basis in credibility than the US Congress. Now that may not be saying very much these days, but it's to say, I don't think that's the reason we get the political outcomes we have in the United States. I think there are many different drivers. The international cooperation bit is caught as collateral damage. Would be my argument on that. Now, come to the Biden administration. Look, I think they walked into perhaps the most ferocious domestic and global agenda that I think I can remember in my entire political life in the United States. And that's not to excuse what may or may not be what we want to see from them and we don't quite have from them yet on the international front. But I think the world is well aware of the political convulsions the United States is going through at the moment at the domestic level. So I don't think the right comparison is domestic spending versus international spending. I would look at what they're doing on the international stage and whether it's enough and what it would take for it to be enough. And I actually give them, on balance, reasonably high marks, given the context in which they're starting. I mean, first, they are unapologetic about the value of multilateralism and recognizing, Nanjala, your excellent points with all of which I basically agree about how that needs to change. Their very first steps were about rejoining everything that had been disregarded by the prior administration. Second, they've done that, I believe, with an effort at humility and a much healthier appreciation of how much many others need to contribute. Now, some of that's about burden sharing, but some of it is actually about appropriate leveling of the playing field and genuinely recognizing that, of course, the United States doesn't have every answer to everything. So there is, I think, a different tone. And third, they are trying a different tack to try to bridge the gap between domestic and international policy. So, this idea of a foreign policy that delivers to the American middle class is core to their philosophy of governing. Foreign policy for any country needs to deliver for its country's citizens. So I think, to me, that's the interesting space to watch. People should absolutely push them to continue to do more where they can do more. And I think we're seeing that with every turn of the wheel. So that would be kind of my report card on where we are now with this administration and what we should continue to press and expect from them. But again, with this very healthy, different appreciation for the fact that they don't have every answer, and we shouldn't expect them to. The last thing I'll just say, Nairi, I'm sure you're right. We are seeing this increasing division into blocks with different philosophies and different institutions. We've been there before. We had decades of a Cold War that looked exactly the same way. Yes, smaller countries can navigate within that, but I don't think that's an optimal place to be. So I guess I still hold out hope that, and there are very specific ways to think about this, that it will be much more of a, not a two-block driven world and not the two-track world that the first panel discussed, but something a lot more heterogeneous. It creates different kinds of arenas for non-usual coalitions, different exertions of power, and therefore different and slightly more liberating outcomes.
Thank you. Nanjala, I was going to ask a question. I have several for you, but I just seen an audience question that I'll pose to you. How can advanced countries, let's just accept the word advanced, I guess more wealthy countries help developing countries industrialize without endangering our planet further? This is a common question. You can dispute the premise if you wish.
That's an interesting question. And I think I would answer it in two parts. The first part is I would say we need to interrogate our idea of what it means to industrialize and what it means to develop. I think that there's been a lot of optimism, for example, about Green New Deals and sort of accelerating past the ugly middle where you kind of had a reliance on coal and a reliance on fossil fuel and going straight into green economies that are predicated on alternative sources of energy, thinking differently about waste, thinking about plastic, thinking differently about the raw materials that made rich countries' industrialization possible. So I think the first part begins with that. Do we have to rethink entirely what our ideas of industrialization are so that our metrics are different, our interests are different? It's not growth, 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 consume, 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 but is actually inclusive, just, fair economies that present opportunities for people who want them and for people who need them. And the second part, I think, is partly tied to the overarching question that we have right now, which is how do we move away from a world that is organized such that poor countries are seen primarily as sources of raw material and not places where people live, and not places where people have families and hopes and dreams and all of the things that I think people in rich countries just maybe don't see in the policy making, in the decision making. I think that especially from the vantage point of an African country, being in service of the foreign policy ideas or aspirations of rich countries often means that our social aspirations, our political aspirations disappear in the conversation. So we're looking at Ethiopia right now and the crisis that's happening in Ethiopia right now. And the only way we can get the kind of attention that that crisis deserves is to focus on what Ethiopia represents to either China or the United States militarily, and not the fact that millions of people have been killed and have been, their lives have been disrupted by this conflict and crisis. And so I think the second part to that is, again, we're reframing, and this goes, I think, to what Elizabeth was saying. We have to go back to the basics of why we're doing all of this stuff. Why did we build multilateral institutions? Why did we build, this system? There was something that we were trying to get at. There was ideas that we were trying to entrench, and I think it's that part often gets lost, and I think it's important to come back to it. So the basic idea of wanting the interests of people, of societies in poor countries to be as well represented as the economic opportunities and the political opportunities that they represent in foreign policy discourse will get us closer to a new way of thinking about industrialization. I'm never going to be one person to say, growth, 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 mine all the things, burn all the things, make all the plastics, use up all the fossil fuels, because I think the way that the world has done that in the last 50, 100 years, we're living with the consequences right now. Not everybody can consume oil, or not every country should be encouraged to consume the way that rich countries have consumed in the last 50 years.
I'm afraid this is going to have to be the final question, Mary, because time has run out. We focused on, the reimagining multilateralism, the Bandung option as well, and the heterogeneous approach, all of which are very interesting. And we're looking forward to the development further of the common agenda. But just to sort of pick a slightly different strand to end on, if there's been a silver lining to the last 18 months, it's the speed with which vaccines have been developed, not distributed around the world, but developed. That took a lot of us by surprise, including the scientific community. Is there an Operation Warp Speed that humanity can jointly produce for climate change?
Oh, wow. Terrific question. There has to be. I mean, I think the note I would end on is to say that you've got to start with the aspiration. When JFK said we're going to make it to the moon, he didn't say, let's see if we can make it quarter of the way and then turn around and come back. He said, let's see if we can make it to the moon. Likewise with vaccinations, the team at Oxford said, let's try and do the impossible. And instead of taking 10 years, let's see if we can do it in 3 months, 6 months. We've now got to do that with vaccinating the world. And on climate change, there really are so many different technologies that are underway right now, whether it's green steel or green cement or green aluminium, that if humans come together and set their aspiration to reach the moon, metaphorically, on climate change, they will achieve. So I think I'd go to there and say, if there's one thing that COVID vaccination taught us, it's that when humans set their aspiration incredibly high, it makes impossible things possible.
Well, that is a suitably and I guess good antidote to a lot of the gloom that surrounds us, and a good note on which to end. But sadly, prematurely, this could go on a lot longer. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, Nanjala, and Nairi, for some really wonderful and interesting remarks that have given me a lot of food for thought. Thanks so much. Now I'm aware I'm supposed to give closing, summarizing remarks of the last really interesting 2 hours, and I just don't want to play the white male voice of God on all of this. What I would urge people to do is go and watch, for those who haven't watched this, go and watch these 3 panels and to share it with other people ahead of UNGA, and of course more generally. The only thing I'd say is that we are obsessed with domestic politics, both in journalism and in life, and they don't tend to deal with these dramatically more important issues that we've just been discussing. And so it's been extremely educational for me, and I hope, as I say, that you'll share it with others. Thanks a lot to the UN Foundation, to FT Live, and to all of you for watching.